I'm now joined by Adrian Foster. He's head of financial markets research in Asia at Rabobank International. Adrian, thank you so much for joining us. So let's start out with these stress tests, because they really seem to be the central issue facing the Eurozone at the moment. How are these stress tests going to impact the ECB's debate today?
I think the significance in terms of today's discussion at the ECB, I think the ECB very much on hold on policy, and when Trichet subsequently holds his press conference, I think he'll be playing his cards very close to his chest, and I don't think he'll be particularly adventurous in any of the statements or any of the responses that he gives during that press conference. And I think the big factor that is, or one factor that's staying his hand, is of course he'd like to see the results of these stress tests, just as everybody would, and they're not going to be available for at least another week.
Now, we've been learning a little bit more about these stress tests. Do you think they're going to be rigorous enough?
I think rigorous, and I'm not sure about rigorous enough. I think we need to understand Europe's in a different situation than the US, and of course the US stress tests were quite well received. They didn't incorporate any percentage of government default, and Europe's stress test is being criticised for not adequately covering the probability of sovereign default amongst the Eurozone countries. Of course, Europe's in a very different situation than the US, so in that sense, Europe has a harder challenge, I think, to meet market demands than the US had.
Right.
You know, and I don't think there's going to be a tidy result. I don't think we're suddenly going to get the results of the stress test and say, there you go, that's the end of that sovereign debt or banking problem issue. This is going to be something which stays with the Eurozone for quite a few years. In that sense, these stress tests are just one of the signposts along the road, I think.
So you don't think these stress tests are going to affect a big change in investor confidence?
I think there's always more information is always better than less. So in that sense, I think they're going to be positively taken. They're not going to answer all the questions that people have. They're not going to tell us that no bank in Europe will lose money in the years ahead. So in that sense, they're not going to be a panacea for market concerns.
Right. Well, let's talk about another issue that faces the ECB, because something's changed since they met last month. They've withdrawn their one-year loans to banks, and that has caused interbank lending rates to go up in Europe. Is that something that you're concerned about? Could that endanger the recovery?
It's certainly an element. I think if you look at those interbank lending rates, in fact, they were increasing before that liquidity was, the 442 billion euro liquidity was matured and withdrawn. Interestingly, in the last couple of weeks, there's been some shorter dated issuance of liquidity, and in fact, the banking system overall took up much less than was widely expected, certainly much less than the 442 billion that it had to pay back. So I think in that sense, there was actually a positive signal in the recent liquidity circumstance in Europe, and that was that banks are nowhere near as starved for liquidity currently as they were a couple of years ago.
Adrian, let's not leave out the Bank of England, because they're meeting as well today. How big of a concern is inflation?
I think it's going to continue to niggle. What's interesting about this Bank of England is, of course, whether anyone joins Mr. Sentence in his calling for a rate hike. Unfortunately, we won't know that until the 21st of July, and that's, of course, when the minutes are released. Prior to that, we won't know the details of any discussion. So that's really the main focus point, in fact, for this Bank of England meeting, 21st of July. Our guess is that nobody joins Mr. Sentence in that call.
Adrian Foster of Rabobank there joining us from Hong Kong.